As we try to identify the unknown, some UFOs defy explanation. At least, it would seem so at first glance. However, just because we can't correctly label an object doesn't mean we should jump to the conclusion that we're being invaded by aliens. Remember, the term UFO does not necessarily mean an interplanetary craft. Jean-Pierre Farabeau was a research engineer working at a physics lab within France's Polytechnical Institute. A few years ago, he wrote a book about unidentified flying weapons.
One possible explanation for UFOs is that they are secret military aircraft. A historian from the CIA even wrote a report claiming that most unexplained UFOs could be attributed to flights by an aircraft referred to as the U-2. Well, it's true that some of the U-2's flight plans did coincide with UFO sightings. But in my opinion, this happened in a very small percentage of cases. There's also the fact that the U-2 was flown for the first time in 1955, whereas UFO sightings began to be reported regularly as of 1947. So the U-2 could certainly be used to explain some of the sightings, especially since it flies at a very high altitude. And it has what you might call a halo effect. Although it is shaped like a glider, glare from the sun's rays may cause it to look circular instead. The fact remains that it appeared in the sky too late to explain the first 8 years of UFO sightings. And there's still the fact that only a few of the U-2's flights correspond to UFO sightings. There were other aircraft built after the U-2 that could have been mistaken for UFOs due to their speed and high flying altitude. They were called Blackbirds. 2 different aircraft were built that closely resembled each other: the CIA's A-12 and the Air Force's SR-71. But once again, the A-12 was flown for the first time in 1962, so it could not account for any sightings before that time. Naturally, it could account for some of the sightings reported since then.
While engineers at the Lockheed Aviation Corporation were designing the U-2 spy plane, officials in charge of technical development within the U.S. Air Force were already conceiving of an even more ambitious project, named Project Silverbug. Their goal was to build a circular craft capable of vertical liftoff and able to fly at an altitude of 80,000 feet and a speed of Mach 3, or 3 times the speed of sound. Development of Project Silverbug was assigned to engineers at the Canadian firm Avro, which had designed the lightweight Arrow CF-105.
The Avro car was an engineering study by the same company that produced the Arrow, the infamous aircraft that was built by the Canadian government and then eventually canceled. In fact, there is a popular movie about it quite recently starring Dan Aykroyd. At the same time they were producing this jet aircraft, they were producing a circular vehicle that was said to be able to rise up on its own power and fly through the air. A number of other devices like this had been produced, but this was the Canadian government's own attempts. Curiously, midway through the development, it too was canceled.
Unable to rise more than a couple of feet off the ground, the Avro car was a failure. Its instability made it dangerous to fly. In 1961, Project Silverbug was terminated, and one of the only 2 models built is now installed on a pedestal in front of the U.S. Army Transport School in Virginia. Could UFO tales have been inspired by test flights of the Avro car or other secret prototypes with an unusual aerodynamic shape, like the YB-49, or perhaps the V-173, nicknamed the Flying Pancake? Or in more recent years, perhaps UFO observers spotted the B-2 stealth bomber or the F-117A fighter, both of which have an unusual shape. According to rumors, recent UFO sightings could be flights of a secret prototype being built in the legendary Area 51, a triangular craft known by the code name Aurora.
Les rumeurs sur l'existence d'Aurora ont été...
Rumors that the Aurora exists have been spread by a magazine that is generally quite serious in nature, the Aviation Week in Space Technology. An article was published in 1990 in which they stated that there had been more than 40 sightings or telephone confirmations by sources within the military, proving the existence of this aircraft, capable of flying at incredible speeds, such as Mach 5 to Mach 8, at extraordinary altitudes, much higher than the blackbirds could fly.
Extraordinaire, encore bien plus haut que les blackbirds. On en a beaucoup parlé.
I heard a lot about this aircraft. Around 1991, and for a year or two afterwards, we heard reports of what were referred to as skyquakes. They were like earthquakes, but they came from the sky. They came from the Pacific coast over California and headed in the direction of Area 51. They would occur every Thursday morning like clockwork. This was rather odd behavior for either a natural phenomenon or extraterrestrial beings. We're not sure why Thursday morning was so important to them. So it seemed to be pretty much of an established fact that it existed, and then we never heard anything more about it. The U.S. Department of Defense formally denied that it existed. We're under the impression that there are sightings of man-made crafts that we should normally be able to explain, but they must be secret military craft, and that's why we can't explain them. But even those don't explain all of the sightings.
There are other phenomena which might help to explain several UFO reports, but they are more difficult to zero in on. There is a whole field of natural phenomena which are mentioned now and then in scientific papers, but remain mysterious and unexplained. Such is the case for seismic lights, or earthquake lights, as they are sometimes called, lights created by earthquakes. France Saint Laurent has taken an interest in this strange phenomenon.
A few UFO reports, and I mean just a few, a very low percentage, can be explained by earthquake lights. But I mean real earthquake lights. As far as I'm concerned, to be earthquake lights, they have to occur during an earthquake or immediately before or after it. There also needs to be a link with tectonic strain. Before an earthquake occurs, there may be a period of months or years during which major forces are at work under the Earth's surface at particular locations. And as this stress builds, it can produce what I call tectonic lights, what others refer to as earth lights.
Well, actually, the interest in luminous phenomena or UFO reports began with really an empirical approach. We were looking at we meaning Ghislaine Lafrenière and I, were looking at the relationship between unusual phenomena, balls of light, unusual animals, and we tried to find out what could be related to them, and we found that earthquakes tend to occur in the same areas. So, as any science would, we pursued that and found out that, sure enough, luminous phenomena throughout the centuries have preceded increases in earthquake activity. Let me address UFO phenomena, which are the balls of light, the unusual colors of lights that inundate, or I should say inundate one's perceptual field, but they show an oscillation. They often look like they're turning, and basically different temperatures reflect different wavelengths and different colors. Those are physical phenomena generated by the Earth itself. Strain within the Earth, stress within the Earth, before earthquakes generate these balls of light. And we know that's correct because in any given area, there's an increase in luminous phenomena before earthquakes occur. The majority of luminous phenomena are tied to imminent earthquake activity, stress and strain within the earth. And the reason we know that is that in areas where there's a buildup of water, for example in reservoirs, or when people pump water into an area, for example to bury hazardous fluids, there's increases in earthquakes locally and also an increase in luminous phenomena. A very small number of luminous phenomena are associated with people having the experience of contact with an alien or contact with some other entity.
We knew that in order to be seeing what we were seeing, there had to be a very strongly charged electric field producing these luminous displays in the sky. We knew that. Since the 1960s and 1970s, scientists have been trying to discover what causes these Earthlights to appear in the sky. They made some discoveries and came up with a few theories. Some scientists researched the lights in a laboratory setting, but what they often found was that their theories only partially explained what was being observed. There were gaps in their theories, but that doesn't matter. That's just normal. After all, they were just starting to research the phenomenon.
Well, one thing we do know is that tectonic strain building up before an earthquake is distributed along earthquake faults, very often along riverbeds or creek beds, on the top of hills, and a variety of unusual phenomena can be generated. Balls of light are simply one. Also, ultrasound can be generated, which very often rats or dogs can hear. Sometimes odd smells are generated. Sometimes if you have a Peltier phenomena, you get a decrease in temperature locally, or sometimes an increase in spontaneous fires. If you happen to be unfortunate enough to walk through these fields, it's going to stimulate your brain directly. And very often, people experience a haunt. And in our research, we find that wherever you have luminous phenomena showing up, so-called UFO flap, you also have an increase of all kinds of other parapsychological phenomena. Haunts, poltergeist reports, basically strange things in general become more frequent, including mundane things like more light bulbs burned out, more alternators in your cars burned out, cars not starting, more anomalous behavior by humans, for example, more suicidal behaviors from protracted depression. These things often occur in clusters.
Even though research into Earthlights is still in its early stages, some scientists are beginning to find possible explanations. One of these scientists is Friedemann Freund, professor of physics at San Jose State University in California.
Purely by accident, I recently came across a scientist who works at San Jose State University in California. He also works for the NASA Ames Research Center. He proposed a theory and created a model to explain how these lights were being produced. I found his theory interesting because it also explained why earthquake lights sometimes do not occur, since we have observed that they don't occur with every earthquake. What is interesting about his theory is that it is based on a discovery that he made several years ago. Below the Earth's surface, among igneous rocks, which form most of the Earth's crust, can be found something called charge carriers. I won't explain the chemistry behind it since it's pretty complicated. So he discovered these charge carriers, which he called positive hole pairs. When there is not much tectonic strain, these charge carriers lie dormant in the rock. On the other hand, when the tectonic strain builds to the point where an earthquake is about to occur, these charge carriers become quite mobile. In his laboratory, Freund calculated that these charge carriers could move as fast as 1,000 feet per second. That's pretty fast. So around the time of an earthquake, we have these charge carriers moving about, spreading throughout the Earth's crust. As these charges move, by definition, each one is a current. In electronics, we call it a hole current. It has a positive charge due to a lack of electrons. When these mobile charges hit the Earth's surface, they generate electromagnetic waves of various wavelengths. They then create a strong electric field at the Earth's surface. Freund calculated that in an ideal setting, for instance at the top of a mountain, the charge could get as high as 1 million volts per centimeter. That's a pretty powerful electric field. Once this electric field is created, it puts a strain on the air, which is normally an insulator. And the air changes from an insulator to a conductor and produces luminous displays in the sky.
One of the conclusions that scientists arrived at during the Pocantico meetings in 1997 was that UFO sightings do not boil down to one single phenomenon. Research by Dr. Michael Persinger at Laurentian University in Sudbury shows that the assessment of these sightings goes beyond a mere "I believe in UFOs" or "I don't believe in UFOs."
One of the lessons we learn in science is that phenomenon such as UFOs, luminous phenomena, that is an over-inclusive label. I'll give you an example. In the late 1800s, the word vapors was used to describe pneumonia, emphysema, tuberculosis, the common cold, and flu as well as cancer. They were all called the vapors because they influenced breathing. Now imagine what would have happened if penicillin was developed then and you gave it to people with vapors. Well, only those with pneumonia would have been beneficial, and people would have dismissed penicillin because it did not treat vapors. The problem is the label. It's over-inclusive. And the same thing with the UFO label. It over-includes a lot of strange phenomena. Most of them have very clear natural bases that we know about now, but there's still others we have to be open-minded about. And just because we're open-minded doesn't mean it's never measurable, which means we ultimately can measure it. In the perspective of science, anything is probable. And if we have a phenomenon such as UFOs, or basically luminous phenomena, that's a more appropriate way to describe them, because UFOs is a pejorative label with all kinds of negative connotations. Odd luminous events. Most of them we know from our data analysis, more than 80% are clearly tied to tectonic strain. We're talking about the real ones now, not the misperceptions. Of the remaining 20%, it's hard to tell what the actual natural forces are. And the possibility that there are other phenomena yet to be discovered, including other intelligences, we still must be open-minded to that possibility.
In general, the scientific community is not interested in UFOs. Why? Obviously, there is the ever-present funding problem. What self-respecting financial institution would put its credibility on the line by financing research into UFOs? No funding, no research. But there is a worse problem: prejudice. To most scientists, the logic is quite simple. If UFOs were real, then there would have to be extraterrestrial spaceships. And since interstellar travel is not possible, UFO reports cannot be true. In all research, observation must take precedence over theory. As Robert Leighton, one of the pioneers of modern physics, once said, "If something happens, it's because it's possible for it to happen." But of all the strange cases that defy explanation, how many are really prototypes of secret military aircraft, and how many are really due to natural phenomena as yet unknown? Could the other cases really be visitors from outer space? For now, it's impossible to say for sure. If there's one thing that holds true in the police world, it's that if you want to solve a problem, you must take an interest in it.
We noticed that the science community turned its back on the Pocantico report. We weren't too surprised, since they've always had that attitude where this subject is concerned. I recently did an audit on the CNES Research Center, and along the way I met some prominent scientists from the technical field. I won't name any names, but I was stupefied by what some of them had to say. In their minds, the only things that truly exist in the field of science are things that can be created in a laboratory setting. If the great minds of science in all countries think like this, then we're not about to make much headway in the science of observation. The problem with UFOs is that we don't see them in abundance. We can say the same thing about scientific facts. Who has ever seen a scientific fact? If anyone ever has, I'd like to meet them. It's impossible. Scientific facts are charts, diagrams, and things you read about in magazines. You never hear anyone say, look, I just saw a scientific fact. If we take a cloud, for instance, sure, it's a scientific fact, but only because it's been studied. Scientific facts do not appear out of thin air. Apples falling from trees were used to make jam long before they became associated with the law of gravity. Newton had to invent the law of gravity first. By the way, the apple story never even happened. So we have a problem. To become a scientific fact, it must first be placed in the proper context. So the question is, what can we do with these UFO reports to capture the interest of scientists? We need to word the problem differently. Just because it's worded in terms of UFOs doesn't mean that the problem should be discarded completely with the claim that UFOs don't exist. That's simply not reasonable.